Yes, Lauren, like I'm really enjoying my time in Canada. Everywhere I've been, it's been wonderful. It's great to meet some wonderful Christian folks. I guess because we're all members of the Commonwealth, we have a lot in common. We all swear allegiance to His Majesty King Charles III. Well, in theory, at least, I guess. Probably doesn't make too much of a difference to how we eat our Weet Bix every morning. Um, but no, it's great to be here. And Yeah, yeah, I really do covet your prayers. Speaking on this topic, it's not just a theoretical thing. Actually, in Australia, it is a big issue. The two things I've been involved in Australia is trying to combat the influence of the gambling lobby, which has massive influence, kind of like the NRA's influence in America. You get the gambling lobby has really captured both political parties, and they own all the sporting teams. You probably get a little bit of that here, I imagine, as well, but also campaigning for religious freedom in a very complex age, and also trying to do thoughtful critiques of Christian nationalism, as that has, expressions all around the world, and with the new volume that N.T. Wright, myself have coming out, that's what we're trying to do, enable Christians to think politically, not just in their own, parochial, myopic context, but think globally and think biblically and think faithfully about how should the churches relate to whatever state that they are in proximity to. And our states are very much shaped by the Westminster system of the Commonwealth countries, which has gradually evolved and developed its own type of secularity. Now, frequently when I'm having discussions with people about religious freedom, how we need to have, a bill prohibiting discrimination on the basis of religion, we need to correct the lacuna in our constitution that does not fully provide religious freedom. When I'm having all these debates with people, often people say to me things. They say, "Michael, we are a secular country. So why don't you and your religious people just go off into a cave somewhere and all die out?" And when people say that to me, I tell them two things. The first thing I say is Australia is not a secular country. It is a multicultural country with a secular government. The secularity of our government is what enables us to be a successful multicultural democracy. Without that level of secularity, we would always have the temptation of having sectarian divisions, whether between Stalinist atheists on the one hand or Christian nationalists on the other hand. So secularity prevents that. And the second thing, when people tell me Australia is a secular country, I ask them, what type of secularism are you advocating for? I once had this, once, I once had an argument with a guy who was a member of the Australian Secular Society. See, the secular society, you think he would know something about secularism. I said, could you tell me how Australian secularism is different from British secularism? He had absolutely no idea. I said, well, what about French secularism? Laicite. Turkey is technically an Islamic secular country. What about the secularism of Japan, China, North Korea? The secularity of America is very much determined by local context. The secularity of Boston is very different from the secularity of Dallas, Texas. And when people realize there's more than one way to do secularism, so, North Korea is not the only show in town, it's a little bit jaw-dropping. They did not know the diversities, the spectrums there is when it comes to secularism. And secularism, I'll be arguing, in its best and benign sense, can actually enhance rather than restrict religious freedom. Because our political constitutions and in the Westminster system has been premised on the idea that government should govern on behalf of their people of all faiths and none. And that's why the assemblies generally try to reflect the diversity of their population in their representatives in parliaments, senates, and whatever legislative assemblies they have. But the secularity of government does not mean that religion cannot speak into our political world. Even with a healthy notion of separation of church and state, those governed
may still appeal to a common consensus and deploy religious resources to urge the state to create a society that benefits people of all faiths and none. And I have to say, at the end of the day, no matter how much of a separation of church and state you have, there is always going to be some connection, some degree of influence between religion and politics. Let me explain why. Okay, governments make laws. Okay, laws are based on policies. Policies are shaped by values, and one of the things that informs values is religion. So there's always going to be somewhat of a dotted line, if you like, a kind of religious influence on politics, because religion affects values, values shape policies, and it's policies which drive the making of laws. In which case, as long as people of faith can vote, discuss politics, run for public office, serve in government, then religion is always going to have some voice, some influence in our theatres of political life. Such is the holy ambivalence, as Jamie Smith calls it, between faith and politics. Now, some people will react to that and say, well, no, there should be no influence on politics. And if a person of faith, a Methodist or a Muslim, gets elected to Parliament, they have to put that faith to the side and simply govern as a normal, irreligious, or non-observant person. But I don't think that's possible. I don't think that's possible. To insist that religious considerations never be brought into the political realm is just impractical. People cannot compartmentalize their beliefs like that. It's impossible because church and state relationships are not always clear cut. Particularly if you look at faith-based education, chaplains in the military, or the way government may fund certain charities like, the Salvation Army. And in a pluralistic democracy, citizens should be free to engage in political persuasion on the basis of religious premises, assuming those religious premises are persuasive to some people. Indeed, democratic and pluralistic societies need to make room for religious voices and religious communities amid the widest sway of voices that can be heard in the public square. If Christians did not get involved politically or exercise their voice politically, there would be no William Wilberforce and the abolitionist movement in the UK. There would be no Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the United States. And furthermore, the presence of Christian voices in Western Parliament should be unsurprising, since most Western nations are indeed founded on a Christian heritage. So we should expect and not fear that Christian voices and values will be reflected directly or indirectly in the debate, discourse, and the legislation that transpires in public. Secularism is not about the muting of religious voices in our political discussions. It's about moderating them according to the rules of fair play. Secularism means there'll be no religious test for public office and no religious exclusion for public office either. So what I want to cover in this talk is kind of a case for secularism, but also I want to advocate initially the case for liberal democracy. And here I'm going to argue that liberal democracy is a specifically Christian project. Indeed, I would say liberal democracy is in effect Christendom 2.0. It is Christendom reloaded, reconfigured, attempting to deal with the failures and fissures of the pre-modern world. Specifically, Protestant Christians, convinced that all truth is God's truth, whether scientific or political, and the belief that all truth is universal, they sought to export the gospel, science, and constitutionalism wherever they went. Now, nobody believes it is self-evident that all men and women are created equal unless they have read Genesis 1:27 about all human beings in the image of God, or they've read John 3:16 that God so loved the world. Human rights, political pluralism, religious toleration, these all have deep roots in countries that have been formed by missional Protestantism. Political liberalism, far from being the formidable foe of Christianity, actually, I would say, is something of its prodigal son, who simply refuses to the belief of its own paternity. Our idea that all human beings have intrinsic value that is something formed in the Christian world. If I can offer a little bit of a sidebar here. One of the debates go on about is about an ethical debate. So one of these sort of things people complain about is the relationship between the Bible and slavery. Okay, and you do have the problem. Paul says things like "slave, obey your masters," which many people will find problematic, particularly when you look at what happened in the antebellum South, or even the way slavery is just assumed to be normal or regulated in the Old Testament. That does kind of strike us. We have a little bit of like, ugh. I'd much prefer if kind of Moses had like the 11th commandment and thou shalt have no slaves. Or Paul said to Philemon, like, oh my gosh, why do you even have a slave? You should totally set him free. Or Peter went to Rome with a sign saying slave lives matter, end slavery now. That's my instinctive thing. I mean, I think all of us here, we take it as obvious. We take it as just analytically true. Sky is blue, grass is green, slavery is wrong. We just take that as morally self-evident, and we have absolutely no idea how anyone could practice slavery. And thus, when we read the Bible, we are a little bit dumbfounded, perplexed, why the God of Scripture allowed slavery for so long. We think this is not the way it ought to be. We treat it as self-evident that slavery is wrong. But there's a reason we think that. Because we have been uniquely shaped by the Christian revolution that has shaped Western civilization. Slavery was practiced by the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, by the Mongols, the Arabs, the Ottomans, all the way up into the 15th century. It was practiced by the Aztecs, and you know what? None of them seem to have thought it was self-evident that slavery was wrong. You don't find the writings of Seneca writing to Nero saying, of course we all know slavery is absolutely wrong, and it's a shame that the Roman Republic has ever tolerated this. But they didn't treat it as being self-evidently wrong. Everyone treated it like it was part of the furniture. It was just a normal part of life. Some people are in slavery, some are not. Some are fit to be ruled, some are fit to dominate them. They just treat it as self-evident. We are the exceptions because we have been shaped by the Christian revolution. So the liberal values we have, we think they're normal and self-evident. We often think we can just take our liberal values and plant them in the Middle East. So we can go into Afghanistan, we can go with our rainbow flags, our liberal views of everything, and that'll work just fine. No, it doesn't. It doesn't, because we have been uniquely shaped by the Christian tradition. And we have to understand, that's because we have to appreciate precisely how Christian political liberalism is. You can have a lot of countries around the world that may be democratic, but they are not liberal. The freedom of citizens in religion, politics, family, day life is not part of the common goods. And it's not treated as self-evident by, I'd say, probably about half the world today. But liberal democracy is liberal in the sense that it regards civic freedoms as an inherent good that should not be subject to any limitation unless it's absolutely necessary. And it's democratic in the sense that voting rights should apply equally to all citizens and every vote should have the same weight. Now, what I want to do is argue that liberal democracy is not perfect, but it's neither the necessary nor the sufficient condition for a just society, but it is the enabling condition for a just society. Now, it may also be hard for us to accept this, but Christians have not always been big fans of democracy. Eusebius of Nicomedia, who was a bit of like a chaplain to the Emperor Constantine, he loved monarchy. He said, look, there is one sovereign, and his sovereign word and law is one. And since God is not a plurality of divine powers, therefore there should be one power. The emperor should be a mirror of the sovereignty of God. And he claimed that democracy only brings anarchy and disorder. I mean, turning to John Calvin, he was not really into any particular form of government. I mean, whether you have kings, senates with free states, he didn't really mind. He said, look, the danger of monarchy was tyranny, but the Herod of aristocracy was factionalism. Calvin's own preference for government was a kind of the civil governance where you get a mixture of aristocracy and democracy. What's really interesting is, everyone here like Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien. In his trilogy, Lord of the Rings, he critiqued authoritarian regimes in his allegories of Isengard and Mordor. But if you ever read the part of the book, The Scourging of the Shire, which doesn't get into the movie, we find Tolkien's implicit critique of the earth-scorching bureaucratization that takes place in democracies. Tolkien was a devout Catholic and a very big environmentalist. He was what you might call a Catholic eco-royalist who preferred a king acting as custodian of the people and their lands. He preferred that over a democratic socialism with its endless bean counters, rules, regulations, and multiplication of committees. In fact, David Bentley Hart, a very interesting eclectic theologian, he calls Tolkien an anarcho-monarchist, which is a very colorful line. Now, I think so. There are different types of governments that Christians have supported over the ages. Now, I think we can support liberalism, the idea that human freedom is an inherent good, when we consider the motif of love of neighbor. In order to love our neighbor, we must allow our neighbor to be beside us, yet to be different from us. Our neighbor has permission to be other, to be different. That requires us permitting and even celebrating the freedom of others to find happiness, fulfillment, flourishing, purpose, and meaning in ways that we might disagree with or sometimes even disapprove of. Unless their happiness is to the direct detriment of our own, our neighbor is free to be who they are, how they are, where they are, whenever they are. Love of neighbor is a way to disrupt hierarchical, grievance-based, identity-ordered ways of assigning status. And the natural sequel to love of neighbor is love of enemies. You know, I've served in the military, and one thing I've learned, do you know what the most ruthless, clinically efficient way is to destroy your enemies? It is to make them your friends. That is the best way to destroy your enemies. The opposite of war is not peace. The opposite of war is friendship and collaboration. Okay? If we recognize that our neighbors have the right to be different to us, and we choose to affirm them in their difference, even if we still see them as a source for our own particular Christian mission, then we will always err towards the freedom of the individual. Now, all these freedoms are often interlock and they interconnect, but it means the freedom of our fellow citizens to be free and to determine their own way of life and happiness is a good thing. It's something they can be free to pursue as image bearers. Liberal democracies or liberalism prefers generosity over conformity, and it chooses to find goodness in others. Now, the qualification we need to make is that the liberty in liberalism is neither absolute nor endless. Law exists to uphold liberty as much as to restrict it. And that is because no person is fully autonomous, a law unto themselves. As free as we are, we still have responsibilities in our choices and our actions and how they affect other people. If everyone does simply what is right in their own eyes, the results could be public anarchy, moral chaos, moral relativism, and the like. I mean, Calvin had a very good saying, which goes back to the Emperor Nerva. He said, "It's indeed a bad thing to live under a prince whom nothing is lawful, but a much worse to live under a prince with whom all things are lawful." The ability to do anything we desire is only good if we desire good things. Christianity provides a source of liberalism to discipline our desires towards good things. Because you could make the case, like in a libertarian society, we should have unfettered access to pornography. You know, what people do between themselves and their IP provider is between them. But then you could also make the case that things like pornography degrade women, degrade the relationship men have with women, and it also leads to things such as sex trafficking and the like. So, yeah, you could argue we can have a libertarian society, but because of the responsibilities of our freedom, we can freely choose to give up those liberties for the common good. And in fact, to diffuse a possible civil war amongst autonomous selves, some kind of compromise must indeed be found if we want the maximum freedom granted to the average individual. So expressive liberalism then must be balanced with our obligations to our fellow citizens. The other good thing about liberal democracy is it's a safeguard against autocracy. Okay, there's a number of things that liberal democracy does that ensures that we will never be ruled by a dictator or a totalitarian. Number one, individual rights. Liberal democracies enshrine individual freedoms in either a constitution or a Bill of Rights or in various laws. Now, these rights give us freedom of thought, conscience, commerce, speech, press, religion, association, voting, and the power to petition and protest. Such rights ensure that all members, all citizens, are able to freely express themselves and pursue their hopes and dreams without fear of reprisal. Second, universal suffrage and participation. Liberal democracies enable and encourage political participation from all members of its citizenry, irrespective of gender, ethnicity, religion, or socio-economic status. I have heard people in America advocate for what's called active citizenship, that your citizens, you should only be allowed to vote if you own property, which would mean there'd be a lot of baby boomers voting, but not a lot of millennials and Generation Z. As a Generation X, that does concern me a bit. But this ensures that all voices and parties and policies can be scrutinized. Elected officials and representatives represent their constituencies. And the main idea of liberal democracy is that government only works with the consent of the government, which I would say is not just a good democratic principle, I think that's also a good Baptist principle. Okay, the church should be run on behalf of the church, on behalf of the priesthood of all believers, not simply to the benefit of priests. Myself, for those who don't know, I'm an Anglican priest, if you're curious. A third thing that's good about liberal democracy, separation of powers. Liberal democracies recognize no branch of government should have unqualified or unfettered power. As such, liberal democracies normally divide between executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. This separation of powers ensures that no branch of government is all-powerful, and that's why the politicization of a judiciary or the partisanship of public servants is a threat to the democratic order. I thought, I don't know about you, when I was watching the news this week, when one of Trump's lawyers was arguing that technically, if the president wanted to, he could order SEAL Team 6 to execute one of his political opponents. But don't worry, he'll then get tried in the Congress and impeached in the Congress and tried in the Senate. I would argue the separation of powers means no, that shouldn't happen. A president or prime minister cannot order that person to do that, because I don't know, in our Westminster system, you have a prime minister, but he does not have the power of the minister. He can command the minister to do something, but the minister can refuse the order. So it's not a direct control, which is, you could argue why a Westminster system maybe is better than a presidential system, but that's another lecture. Fourth, liberal democracies also give us peaceful conflict resolution. Liberal democracies, I mean, they do carry a certain tension, even a key vulnerability, because if all these people are free in their ideology, their views and perspectives, you're going to have a lot of different views. You're going to have a lot of different opinions, and these are going to come into conflict with each other. Okay, so you're going to have your somewhat progressive horse riding vegan will come up with the kind of, emo goth who kind of likes NASCAR. I mean, these people may collide in their opinions. They may not get on with each other. So we've got to have mechanisms in which disagreements can be resolved peaceably. They can be resolved in the ballot box rather than pistols at dawn, if you get what I mean. Okay, and the other problem is democracies can be compelled to tolerate and enfranchise people who stand in resolute opposition to the very idea of democracy itself. So it means we do have to tolerate people who would like to see the whole system come tumbling down, but that's simply the price we pay for having a free country with free expressions of opinion. Fifth, we've got economic opportunity and equality. Um, when you have freedom of converse, freedom of trade, you're more likely to promote economic prosperity, upward mobility. You can do that where you have a free economy. Six, government transparency and accountability. Liberal democracies hold elected officials and government institutions accountable to the people. This ensures that government policies are transparent and responsive to the needs of the people, and corruption and abuses of power are eliminated. If I can give you one example from the Canadian context where this didn't happen, I'll never forget the most famous video of Justin Trudeau. I don't want to pick on Justin Trudeau too much, but since we're in Alberta, uh, uh, I'll never forget watching a sort of, question time in the Canadian Parliament, and Prime Minister Trudeau was asked how often has he had to meet with the Ethics Commissioner, like how many number of times. He kept saying, "I'm very happy to meet with the Ethics Commissioner if she wants to see me," and the opposition leader said, "Well, yeah, we want to know how many times have you met with the Ethics Commissioner?" Trudeau said, "Well, I'm very happy to meet with the Ethics Commissioner." And they asked him again, "No, can you give us a number? How many times have you had to meet with the Ethics Commissioner?" And Trudeau said, "Look, anytime the Ethics Commissioner wants to see me, my door is open. I'm very happy." And for me, that wasn't transparent and accountable government. Okay, and I think it was a little bit of a joke, and I think it was a sad moment for Canadian democracy. But the seventh thing we also get in liberal democracies is rule of law and judicial independence. If you've lived somewhere like Russia or China, where, I mean, Russia is effectively more like a mafia state, and judges know if they don't come up with the right verdict, they'll be getting a knock on the door with some very, very serious people. Or in China, where the judiciary just basically implements the will of the government. Rule of law is fundamental in liberal democracies, and that means no one person, not even those in power, are above the law. Everyone, especially those in public office or in public service, are held accountable for their actions. And the rule of law means you have to have judicial independence and the ability of magistrates to review legislation. And I would say there is a final element of liberal democracy, and this is one I think is probably one of the most typical features of Canada right now, and this is the idea of self-critique. Open and free societies are able to engage in a transparent critique of themselves. The earliest example of this I can find comes from a Greek play by Euripides called the Trojan Women. It's about the women who were taken captive during the conquest of Troy, when all Achilles and all the Greeks kind of beat Troy in Asia Minor. But the play is not actually about Troy. It's actually about the Athenian League and how it started off as a defense pact against the Persians, and then the Athenians actually began to kind of extort other city-states for money. So it's kind of an allegory in the same way the 1950s play what's the one 1950s play kind of like a witch hunt, The Crucible, in which the Crucible is an implicit critique of 1950s McCarthyism. So too was the Trojan Women really a critique of the way that the Athenians were acting towards other city-states in the Delian League. Again, we could also think here of the British Empire actually was very good in its self-critique. A good example of that is when the British invaded India. I mean, they did some horrible things. They did some. You had Robert Clive of India, who was responsible for hundreds and thousands of deaths and enriched himself incredibly. But the East India Company was put on trial in the House of Lords, and Edmund Burke prosecuted the East India Company for its many crimes against the Indian people. Now, and here's the weird thing: the Persians also invaded India shortly before. No one in Persia put the Persians on trial for what they did, or even amongst the Afghan tribes in the north, or the Marathas in the south. Many people invaded, India, but the only people who put themselves on trial for what they did were the English. So within Christian societies, there's always been this question where people have asked, "Hang on, are we the baddies? Because we thought we were the guys, in the white hat, the good people, but maybe we're behaving a little bit like the baddies." And I do think this is one aspect of Canadian culture. There is the sense in which Canadians do have this propensity to really do engage in a bit of critique of themselves, almost to a kind of like civil or moral self-flagellation. Some people talk as if Canada is one of the most evil and horrible countries in the world, which then beggars the mind as to why do people from all over the world keep moving here, isn't it? But you do find a little bit of that in Canada. Now, this discussion is admittedly a little bit Anglo-Eurocentric, and we've got to think about Christians in other parts of the world. In other parts of the world, they say, look, for us, the common good isn't about individual freedoms. It's more about the economic state of the whole country. So other countries, they're going to have a less of a focus on individual freedoms and more on the collective good of the wider society. So we do have to recognize that even our focus on individual freedoms is something that is perhaps unique to our own context, our own heritage, history, and our own society. Other societies maybe think, well, not individual freedom, but maybe the collective good is what we need to focus on. Now, that said, I think there is, even with the weaknesses of liberal democracies and the fact that maybe it does not fit in every part of the world, I don't think you can just completely transport it in other countries, nations, and cultures. Because again, it works here because we've been shaped by the Christian tradition. That said, there is nothing to stop us from advocating and even celebrating democracies as one of the most noble achievements of human civilization. Achievements that would have not have happened, never even been conceivable, apart from the Christian heritage of the West. There would be no human rights, no self-evident truths without scriptural notions of the image of God and love your neighbor as yourself. As Luke Bretherton notes, Christians do not need democracy to practice their faith, but democracy enshrines some central Christian commitments, and so, as a judgment of practical reason, democracy should be an aspirational feature of political order for Christians. And I would hasten to add that women, the vulnerable, the ill, the infirm, sexual minorities generally fare better in liberal democracies than any alternative system of government. Refugees do not flee from liberal democracies, but they do flee to them. In addition, every change of government without bloodshed, every inquiry that exposes government corruption, every journalistic report that demands action on police brutality, every citizen that wins an appeal against the government shows that liberal democracy, though not necessarily perfect, is eminently preferable to other types of government around the world. And that is why we must protect our democracies. We must value them. We must be vigilant against free market fundamentalism that exploits the poor and vulnerable, against militarism that urges war, not peace, and escalating authoritarianism that tells us that diminishing liberty is the only path to safety. It does not normally happen overnight. The erosion of liberal democracy can be a stealth-like erosion of liberal democracies, their processes, institutions. It happens when people just assumed that the checks and balances would kick in, when people thought that they could use some reprehensible group for their own ends, only to find themselves being used instead. Democracy falters when we take democracy for granted, rather than prizing and cherishing the freedoms it gives us. Democracy can atrophy. We can simply assume it rather than defend it. It's a type of apathy that transpires when citizens refuse to be vigilant. Democracy dies when people refuse to speak and act. You can see this happening in various places around the world where democratic systems are gradually being worn away by different forces and factors in their society. We pray that it'll never happen to us, but that's the thing.
It can happen to us. I have to tell you something I've learned as well. The greatest evils in the world are not done by people who believe that what they do is wicked. It's done by people who believe that what they do is righteous. And if people believe that, in order to save group X, we've got to get rid of the Jews, or the Catholics, or the immigrants, or the working class, that's where the greatest evil lies, when people believe that their vision is the only one that should be accepted because they alone have the path to survival. May that never happen, but it can happen. And I'll leave you with a quote from Timothy Schneider. He said, "If none of us is prepared to die for freedom, then all of us will die under tyranny." And there, my friend, ends the lecture.
Dr. Bird, for our lecture. What questions would you like to pose and put on the table for discussion today? We have folk way in the back, so I can come back there as quickly as we have them up here. So, all right. The rally will keep us started. Thank you, sir.
Is there a question quota?
I try to keep it to one per. I'm wondering, you gave that list of 8 things that liberal democracy does. In the present day secular world that we live in, especially in the West, which liberal democracy would you hold up as an example of one that's really firing on all of those 8 cylinders?
Look, I would argue that I think Canada, Australia, New Zealand, to be honest, a lot of the Anglophone countries, I do think them fairly well. You could probably also look to other countries, perhaps Netherlands, Belgium, and others. And some of these can be republics, some will be constitutional monarchies. I think they both they work quite well. But I would say no liberal democracy is perfect. In Australia, like we've got several problems. Like again, the massive influence of the gambling lobby in Australia, which means it's impossible to get legislation passed to curtail the influence of what's going on there. So I mean, I wouldn't say that's perfect either. We do have some what I would call moderate religious freedom issues in Australia, and and some state governments do have more of a penchant for acting in somewhat more, how can I put it, or semi-autocratic ways, or trying to circumvent democratic processes and accountability wherever possible. But generally, I think those countries are where it's working fairly well.
Someone else?
I thought there'd be more questions about secularism.
Well, there might be. There's no quota.
Thank you. You mentioned that you see liberal democracy as highly influenced by Christian values. Do you think it's also influenced by Enlightenment values?
Oh, undoubtedly. And the big debate is which one is the biggest influence. Some people want to say it's only influenced by Christian values. Others want to say it's only an Enlightenment project. There's no doubt you get a bit of both. And I think you see that in someone like John Locke, who is a political philosopher who is clearly shaped by the Christian tradition, but he's clearly also heralding in this new era of Enlightenment values. And Locke goes on to have a big influence on from British constitutionalism to American republicanism. So yeah, I probably didn't bring that out enough. That there's definitely an Enlightenment tradition that is part of the overall picture, how we kind of evolve into liberal democracy.
With your take saying that democracy is likely the best form of government in terms of freedom of religion and things like that, what are your thoughts on prevailing ideas, especially in post-secondary education in the States and social media, that Marxist ideas are gaining a lot of traction? Like, what should our response be to that?
I think there's a number of things you have to say. You've got to be, people can call a lot of things Marxism, they're not necessarily Marxist. Okay, there's a start. And I would also argue that, I mean, people talk about cultural Marxism, and I would argue some of the cultural Marxism is some of the most un-Marxist stuff you can get. For example, Marxism is very much concerned with the ideal society where the distinctions between people do not really matter. Okay, distinctions of race, religion, and trying to create a classless society. Whereas if you say no, we should rank everyone according to their moral identities, that's the complete opposite of Marxism. Marxism, that would be anathema, because they're always trying to, they talk about creating the ideal man, okay, the person who transcends differences, so there is economic equality. And once you've got economic equality, all the other differences don't really matter. So real Marxism, I don't think would qualify, it's a loaded term, as woke, okay, if you like. And for me, wokeness is based on the idea that all disparities between people are inherent injustices. That's what I think sort of woke ideology is about. Marxism, I don't think is a woke ideology in that sense. It's all about the universal man who is transcending differences, whereas some progressive ideologies want to magnify those differences, so you have a bunch of discrete identities that are constantly at war with one another, and there's no redemptive moment between them. Okay, that's what I would see the big difference. In terms of a critique of Marxism, what I would say about Marxism, this is going to sound really weird, but this is now the fourth lecture, so we're pretty deep into weird already, aren't we? I would say the problem with Marxism is it's both too Christian and not Christian enough. So let me explain by what I mean there. If you read the Gospels, there's a lot of stuff there that does sound like proto-socialism. You know, like what does John the Baptist say? You know, if you've got two coats, give to someone who's got none. Look at the early church where they had all possessions in common. You know, when Paul says to the Corinthians, like, you know, we've received, you know, spiritual blessings from the Jews, therefore we should give back to them, so there would be equality between the churches. And what about have you read Mary's Magnificat? Have you read that lady was a borderline communist. She's if you read the Magnificat, it's like, you know, God has brought down the mighty from their thrones. He's lifted up the poor. The rich have been sent away hungry. I mean, this is why Mary's Magnificat was banned in certain countries. Like, you know that song, Mary, Did You Know? They should rewrite that to be like the Magnificat, you know? Mary, did you know that your Magnificat makes you sound like a raving Marxist? Mary, did you know that powerful men consider your words alarmist? Mary, did you know that governments try to ban the song you sang? And although I am a Protestant, I really want to join your gang. Mary, did you know? So yeah, so there are parts of the Bible that do sound a little bit socialistic, and in fact, you could argue that certain parts of Marxism, you know, have little bits of inspiration from the Christian scriptures. Or read the Cappadocian Fathers, what they write about social justice. I think it's Gregory of Nyssa's got to work on literally social justice. So even Marxism does have a little bit of Christianity into it. In fact, Tom Holland, again, not Spider-Man, the historian, simply says Marx was basically just like a bad Cappadocian church father, but with bad metaphysics. Okay? And remember what Jesus said, the first will be last and the last will be first. That is basically the Marxist project. The difference is the Marxist thinks they can manufacture that. They cannot wait for the final assize. They cannot wait for the ultimate manifestation of God. Their view, it's like, we just got to cut the heads off the bourgeois, the factory owners, the capitalists, and anyone whose iPhone is newer than mine. Okay? If we cut the heads off all those people, then the first will be last and the last will be first. And we can all sit around the campfire
singing Mary, Did You Know, the Marxist version. Okay, so in one sense it's too Christian because it thinks it can bring that great reordering of power, but not by God building his kingdom, but through the means of violent revolution. So in one sense, the problem with Marxism is it's too Christian. It's got an over-realized eschatology. It wants to manufacture the Christian idea of a radical reordering of power. The first will be last and the last will be first. And it wants to do that with a materialistic worldview and with one act of despotism. Okay, so it's too Christian. But here's the other side of Marxism. It's not Christian enough because Marxists lack a doctrine of total depravity. They believe evil is what resides in the bourgeois, the capitalists, the kulaks, the peasants, or the Jews who have been hoarding money and conspiracy theories as they go. They don't understand that sin affects all human beings, even the Marxist, that we all have an innate propensity to be greedy. In other words, Marxists don't understand how they all have the potential to internalize their own capitalism and to become the capitalist of their own soul. And they would not put checks on balances on each other because they wanted an enlightened Marxist despot to put everything in order. And what followed was not a great reordering of power and paradise on earth. It was hell on earth. And every Marxist regime starts off by saying, and this was in Venezuela with, who's the famous Venezuela guy? Chavez, Hugo Chavez. Like, critiquing the Soviet Union. We're not going to be like them. We're not going to make the mistakes. It's kind of like, every time someone does communism, it goes wrong. But this time I think it will work, and it never does. And we know Chavez's regime, whatever the merits of its beginning, anything it did, it has become a despotic and authoritarian regime. Because they think evil is what the other people do, and they don't want checks and balances. They don't want the separation of powers. They don't want a proper democracy, and that is why I'm not a Marxist. As well as that, I've actually know people who've lived in Marxist countries, and yeah, they also provide a good testimony on it as well. So that was probably a much longer answer than maybe you were getting, but yeah, come for the lecture, stay for the singing.
Yeah. Aren't you glad you came this afternoon for that? That was awesome. Fantastic. Are you going to have a musical version of the book?
Well, here's what you have to remember in terms of like biblical scholar now. Before that, I was a paratrooper, but I actually wanted to write musical theater.
Yeah.
And every now and then, musical theater, Mike, makes a little bit of an appearance.
Yep.
And today you got a little bit of the appearance of a musical theater, Mike. But come back tomorrow, maybe we'll bring out Paratrooper Mike. Tomorrow in the final lecture, I'll be talking, we'll simply finish up talking about the kingdom of God. Marxists want to do it with one violent revolution. I'm going to talk about the kingdom of God. And can we build the kingdom of God? Do we witness to it? Do we contribute to it? What does our witness work? How does our work, even in like society and politics and witnessing, how does that contribute to the kingdom? That's what we're going to talk about in the final lecture.